Today I'm going to share two stories, one that happened to two hunters while out deer hunting, and one that happened to a father and son while camping out in Colorado. As well, at the end of this episode, I'm going to do something completely different that you're not going to want to miss out on. But before we get into today's stories, welcome back to Dark Wilderness. If you've had an encounter with anything you would like to have shared on the show, please email me at the link below. If you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And the next time you're out in the woods and some weird stuff starts happening, don't forget to smack that subscribe button, make it fall down on the ground so that you can get away, so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounters. This first story happened to a couple of lifelong friends. We're going to name them Kyle and Robert. Kyle and Robert were very avid deer hunters. They had gone deer hunting together for years. And on this particular season, Kyle had actually filled his tag very early on. So that really only left Robert with a couple of options. And that was to either go solo hunting by himself or wait for when Kyle could go and they could party hunt together. On this one day, Robert had gone out solo hunting by himself. Kyle was just taking it easy at home, relaxing, and early that afternoon, Kyle noticed his phone was starting to vibrate. So he picked his phone up, looked, and it was a message from Robert. Robert had shot a doe, and it had ran into the bush, and he was needing some help to track it. Now, because Robert was Kyle's best friend, Kyle just could not let Robert have to deal with that on his own, so he decided, you know what, I'm just going to pack up all my gear, I'm going to head out there, and I'm going to help him locate this deer. So that's exactly what Kyle did. He loaded up all of his gear into his vehicle, and he made that hour-and-a-half drive to this location where Robert was hunting. Now, even though they would hunt together all the time, Kyle had never been to this particular property before. They would only hunt this one property when they were together, and whenever one of them would go off on a solo hunt, they would hunt different properties. So Kyle really had no real lay of the land. He had no real idea of what was on this property or anything like that. But once he got there, Robert met him at his truck. Kyle got all of his gear on, and the two of them made their way to the spot where Robert had shot that deer. Now, because it was an hour-and-a-half drive from where Kyle lived to this property, by the time Kyle got out there, it was already quite late in the day. The sun was starting to go down. So these two men, they really did not have a lot of time to try to pick up the trail from this deer. When they got to the spot where Robert had shot it, the sun was pretty much fully down at this point. So it took them a little while to actually pick up on this blood trail. Once they picked up on the blood trail, they started making their way across this clearing towards this bush line. Even though they were using flashlights, they were having a very hard time keeping on top of this trail, and they were making very slow progress across this clearing. Now, if you've ever tracked a deer before, especially if it's been at night, it can be very difficult depending on the shot placement on the animal, and that's something that Kyle and Robert were experiencing in this moment. It was not a great shot, so the blood trail was very minimal, the grass was high, so they were really having a hard time. After tracking for a little while, Kyle looked up towards the bush line where that deer had ran, and he noticed this incredibly bright light inside the bushes about 8 feet off the ground, and it was perfectly round and completely bright white. Kyle just kind of stood there looking at this light, trying to figure out, is this a yard light? Is this a drone? Is this somebody with a headlamp on? And he stood there for a couple of minutes just kind of staring at this light in the bush. Finally, he turns to Robert and asks him, hey, is there a house over there? Like, are there any other houses in the area? And Robert was completely puzzled by this because he knew that there were no houses in the area. So he looked at Kyle and said, there's no houses. Like, what are you looking at? And Kyle pointed towards the light and said, look at that bright light. So Robert looked towards this light as well, and it completely shocked him. He had no idea where this light was coming from, why it was so bright, and it appeared that it was moving towards them. But even though this light was moving towards them, what was really puzzling Robert and Kyle both was the fact that this light was not bobbing up and down, it was not moving left or right, like as if somebody had a headlamp on. So these two men just stood there looking towards it, trying to figure out what it was, and this light continued to come closer. As it got to the edge of that bush line, this light raised from about 8 feet up to 15, back down, back up to 15. Both men at this point were just completely baffled. They had no idea what this was that they were experiencing. But Kyle's a very naturally curious person, so he turned to Robert and said, "Hey, let's try to get closer." Robert was a bit taken back by what his buddy was saying to him, so he's like, "Why?" And as soon as he said why, the entire area around them lit up in a grayish white light. At this point, both men decided, you know what, we don't want any part of this light. So they turned around and they headed back to their trucks. The next morning, they went back to the property to continue trying to find that deer. And they briefly spoke about what had happened the night before because they had no idea what it was that they had experienced. They had no idea what this light was. And when they got to where this light had been, they found that deer not very far away. Kyle ended up going and talking to a neighboring property owner, and the fellow that owned that property ended up telling Kyle that he had had a few experiences with this light as well, and that he had never told anybody for fear of being crazy. Now, Kyle knows that this was not a person wearing a headlamp. This was definitely not a drone. And he kind of looked into some stuff online, and he found a Native American folklore about orb lights that guide white-tailed deer. And he truly believes that that light that they experienced that night was one of these orbs from Native American folklore, and it was kind of trying to guide them to where this deer was so that it would not go to waste. Now, let me know what your thoughts on this orb was and their experience. I'd really like to know what you guys think about that. I myself, I've never heard of these orbs. I'm definitely going to have to take a look into those. This story happened to a fellow that I'm going to call Mark for this story and his son while they were out camping in the Colorado range. Mark grew up in Colorado. He grew up out of the country, and he was very experienced when it came to the wilds of Colorado. He spent a lot of time backcountry camping, and he was really at home in the wilderness. At this point in Mark's life, he was feeling a little bit bogged down. He was not quite feeling the suburban lifestyle, and he decided that this would be a good opportunity for him and his 5-year-old son to go do a solo camping trip without his wife, without his younger son, and just kind of give them a chance to bond. So he talked to his wife gave the green light, and then he started planning this trip. He did not want to go anywhere too remote with his son for his son's first camping trip, and he found a place called Gordon Gulch, which was located just west of Boulder. It looked absolutely perfect to Mark, so he figured that's where he's going to take his boy. So he planned out the trip. Him and his son on the weekend loaded up in the vehicle. They made their drive out to Gordon Gulch. They set up camp. Once they had their tent set up, they spent a little bit of time going collecting firewood. Once they gathered up what they thought would be enough wood for the night, they decided to go fishing. While they were on their walk to go fishing, they saw a moose and they saw a bobcat, and his son was just absolutely ecstatic and was just having the time of his life. After a few hours of fishing, they made their way back to camp. They made a fire. Then they sat down for a nutritious hot dog and marshmallow meal. After a little while, his son was starting to get pretty tired, so Mark brought him over to the tent, tucked him in, lied down beside him, and Mark tried to fall asleep as well. Mark was incredibly exhausted from all the walking that they had done, but he for some reason just was having a really hard time falling asleep that night. Eventually though, Mark was able to fall asleep. However, in the middle of the night, Mark was all of a sudden jolted awake by something. He was trying to figure out what just woke him up. He sat there for a second and then he realized that his son was giggling. Now, Mark's son is what Mark describes as a sleep talker, so he tends to talk a lot in his sleep, and that's exactly what Mark thought was going on at this point. He could hear his son giggling beside him, so he started to lie back down in his sleeping bag when all of a sudden from the other side of the tent, he heard laughing back towards his son. So he quickly shot back up, turned, and was kind of focused on that side of the tent, trying to figure out if that was an echo he heard, if it was his son, or if there was somebody outside of this tent. He sat there for a few minutes, didn't hear it again, so he lied back down in his sleeping bag and tried to fall back asleep. Shortly after, he could hear his son giggling again, so again, Mark shot up, turned, and was looking in that direction where he had heard that giggling before. And this time he did not hear giggling, but he heard somebody saying his son's name. Mark at this point is just completely terrified. There's somebody outside of his tent talking to his young son. And he realized in that moment that that giggling he heard before was definitely not an echo, and it definitely was not his son. It was definitely somebody else outside of the tent. Mark sat there for a second just staring, listening to this voice calling to his son, and he started to realize that this voice was actually the voice of his younger son who was back at home. Mark knew that there's no way that this is his younger son because his wife and his younger son are a couple 100 miles away back at home, and they would have no way to get where he was, and even if they were going there, his wife would have told them. At this point, Mark is completely freaking out and he had no idea what to do. So he reached down beside him and he pulled out of his pack, he pulled his sidearm. In that moment, he cocked it back, he yelled outside the tent that he had a gun, and then he made his way to the zipper of the tent. He slowly unzipped the zipper, stepped out, gun ready, turned towards where that voice had been, shone his flashlight, and didn't see anything at first. He kind of took a step back, pointing his light into the bushes in that direction, when all of a sudden he saw these two round yellow eye reflections looking right back at him, and these were about 4 feet off the ground. He kind of stood there, pointing the flashlight, pointing his weapon towards these eyes, when all of a sudden these eyes rose to about 10 feet off the ground. Mark at this point, not knowing what he was dealing with, just fired his gun up into the air. No sooner did he fire that shot, those eyes disappeared, and then he heard something incredibly large running through the trees away from the tent. His son at this point was absolutely freaking out. He was crying, he was screaming. So Mark picked him up, brought him to the vehicle, and he didn't waste any time tearing down camp. He just got him and his son out of there. Now, Mark would definitely like to go back to this place again to try to figure out what this was that him and his son encountered, what was trying to lure his son out of the tent. To me, this sounds a lot like Skinwalker behavior. Heard a lot of stories very similar to this, where a voice will be calling to somebody, trying to lure them into the woods, trying to lure them out of a tent, and it'll always be a voice of somebody that person knows or recognizes, like a loved one or a friend. But I would really like to know your thoughts on this, so if you have any thoughts at all, please leave that in the comments below. I'd really love to know what you think about that. Now, as mentioned, I'm going to do something a little bit different that I haven't done before. I received a comment on one of the Feral People videos that really stood out to me, so I'd like to read that comment to you, and if this is something that everybody likes, I'm really thinking that I might do this at the end of every video, kind of go over the top comments from past videos. So I'm just going to get right into this. This one came from Adam. It says, my Uncle Jay loved to hunt ginseng in the mountains of Cook County, Tennessee. He told me one time that he sneaked into the Smokies where he found more ginseng than a man could sell. He had a man in Knoxville he would sell it to. The man named Yang would give my Uncle Jay marijuana joints and cash money. One time Yang gave my Uncle Jay a bad joint and Jay lost his mind. They admitted him to Eastern State Mental Hospital in Knoxville where they said he was too far gone. They sent him back to home in Cosby where he would dress in my Aunt Myrna's clothes and hike to Knoxville. Aunt Myrna was torn up about this. She was so devastated she couldn't eat and basically wasted away. Uncle Jay took to wearing no clothes around the house, and then was arrested hitchhiking naked to Knoxville. He got out of Eastern State again, and after a month was sent home where he took off to the deep woods of the Smokies. Uncle Jay has been tracked by the Park Service but never caught. They apparently have pictures of his skinny naked ass running through the laurel thicket. He was last reportedly seen by backcountry hikers who smelt marijuana burning, but he ran off. He is a feral human. they do exist. I just found that comment kind of funny. I don't mean to be disrespectful about that, just the word usage with the part where he said, picture of his skinny naked ass running through a laurel thicket. I had that weird image stuck in my head for a while. But as always, thanks for joining us, and I'll see you next time.